Greetings. Welcome to Cyber Focus, your source for international business information. I'm your host, Ryan Craven, and our guest today is Professor Andrew Butters. Andrew is an assistant professor in the Business Economics and Public Policy Department at the Kelley School of Business at IU. He is also a visiting scholar at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. Prior to joining Kelley, he was an associate economist in the Economic Research Department at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. Today, Andrew is going to share with us his take on the current economic situation and some areas that make this recession unique. We'll also talk a bit about the pandemic and its impact not only on the U.S. economy, but also the global economy as well. Andrew, thanks for being here today. Thanks again for taking some time with us today. And yeah, we'll just kind of jump into it. As we're getting close to the end of that first quarter of 2021, we're here to talk a little bit about the economy. So kind of where are we at?
It's a simple question, but obviously one that's a little bit difficult to put a very fine point on. And so let me actually speak a little bit about just, kind of where we've been before I, now the Q1 and maybe what people can expect or should, think about in terms of going forward in 2021. So, this last year has really, really been unprecedented. We saw in terms of just GDP for the United States, we saw the record decline in economic activity, as well as one of the strongest rebounds in economic activity just within the last year. And now, while that rebound was very, very large and very, very robust, it still hasn't gotten us quite back to the pre-pandemic levels that we were experiencing, say, as early as Q1 of 2020. And so, where does that all leave us? That leaves us on pretty shaky ground when it comes to how is the economy doing? On top of that, the destruction of the labor market has been really, really devastating. So actually, an indicator that just came out this morning is the initial unemployment insurance claims. These are weekly reports of how many people filed for their first week of unemployment. And this morning, that number came out, it was around 680,000. Now, that number just completely out of context might not mean a whole lot to many of you, but for those of you or those that track this indicator, that's the first time at which we've reached below before the pandemic's all-time record. So literally over the last 52 weeks, we have experienced a record number of people filing for their first week of unemployment insurance over this entire year. And so, and that even exceeded millions of people in a few of the weeks really, really early on in the pandemic. And so, the destruction that we've experienced as really just a consequence of the responses from this public health crisis have been quite devastating. And this has also been, just as it was a global pandemic, this was also a global recession. So, almost every major economy saw a contraction in economic activity, China being here kind of the lone exception to that rule. And we saw trade volumes plummet at the height of the pandemic and really having a really devastating impact on supply chains. And so now, with all that said, that's sort of where we've been. As you mentioned, we're wrapping up Q1 now, and really, to be honest with you, I'm relatively optimistic. So the recent news when it comes to the vaccine and really actually the number of COVID cases coming down dramatically in the United States. I know there's variation abroad that we'll probably speak to later on in the discussion, but really, most of the forecasts for economic activity in the United States have actually been trending upward or ticking upward. So, in terms of Q1, some of the latest estimates and forecasts that I keep an eye on, have GDP coming in around 5%. And in terms of the year outlook, in terms of 2021, I would expect a similar number in terms of an improvement in GDP growth. And so that would very much put us then sort of back above pre-pandemic levels, potentially even as early as maybe Q2 of 2021, but most certainly on the back half of 2021.
Yeah, I kind of mentioned too, this recession and kind of dip, it's just different, right? It feels a little bit different than it has in the past. And it seems like every new recession is kind of caused by a different thing or has a different impact, which makes a certain amount of sense, but kind of what is this? Why does this one feel this different?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think economists typically kind of get in trouble every time a recession happens that no one's able to predict, and everyone says, well, why weren't you able to come? Oh, well, no, this one's different. This one's different. I promise. Had it not been different, we would have been able to you figure this out. And I guess on this one, I think we might need to give the economists the benefit of the doubt here. This one was truly unprecedented. We had the speed and depth of this decline in economic activity was something we've never seen before. And on top of that, the very fundamental driver of it was substantially different. This wasn't a business cycle in a traditional economic sense. This was a public health recession. And actually, I'd also just like to speak to kind of the Great Recession, because while it's been a long time since we've experienced the Great Recession, that is sort of the most natural benchmark, and that was also a very significant recession. But in retrospect, after we've done the post-mortem on that recession, that one actually turned out to be relatively speaking a pretty traditional recession in the way economists like to think about it. It was certainly a broader and more significant economic contraction, but there wasn't anything altogether like dramatically out of sorts when it comes to the underlying mechanisms. This one's just not that way. And just to give some indicators of just what are the things that are showing up in the data that just really have economists kind of thinking about, all right, well, now how should this guide us thinking about the recovery? Is we've seen growth in housing starts and home prices. That's not something you typically see in recessions. We've seen actually through much of the effort on the part of the federal government and the fiscal stimulus, we've actually seen real personal income increase during this period of time. And then on top of it, I've already mentioned the labor market, but we've seen just this really, really almost immediate and really, really quick situation where we've had people that have been separated from jobs end up at this stage in the recession be long-term unemployed, and that's happened much, much quicker than say in the Great Recession, which also was one that was very impactful on the labor market, but just took a much longer time to have a situation where we had lots and lots of people long-term unemployed. And so this one's just it's different. There's no way around it, and I think something that we'll need to keep in mind as we're thinking about the recovery.
Yeah, and you mentioned, right, one of the biggest causes for this recession was, a public health crisis, and that's just not here in the U.S. That's globally, right? And so, it wasn't necessarily an economic driver that happened, say, here or elsewhere, and kind of fueled that across the globe. It's everybody's kind of coping with this same health crisis in different capacities and different perspectives. And I think my take on it, right, is as a layman is a little bit, everybody wants to get back to normal. Everybody wants to go out and spend money, but due to the impact of the health crisis, right, that's kind of what makes this one different in my mind. Is there wasn't a specific trigger on the economic side. The recession is almost the result of the public health crisis.
Yep, I think that's really nicely put, and I think that's exactly right. I mean, we much of the stimulus and much of the actions that have been taken by the government have been really very much in the way an attempt to provide a stopgap, but at some level, the elixir, so to speak, for the economy is going to be when things can open up and consumers can show back up. The businesses and the firms that are being so hurt right now and so devastated when it comes to a revenue side of things. They can be supported by the government through PPP or what have you, but it's really going to be the consumers coming back that provides the robust recovery that we're looking.
Yeah, and hopefully that'll increase the unemployment numbers, or improve the unemployment numbers, right? With how many of those folks are in the service industry, tourist industry. As demand goes down, production gets laid off and all that stuff. So everybody wants this. And I mean, you can just see it. You can see it in the restaurants and out and about, right? Everybody is itching to go back out and spend and spend money, and kind of hoping that funnels people to kind of get those jobs back in place and have that support and have that money. So we've definitely seen different responses to the pandemic, and different states, and the government has kind of revamped its policy and adjusted a bunch of different times too in ways. Yeah, kind of what's some of those impacts and continued impacts going forward?
Yeah, so great points. You hit on a couple key pieces here. So we've had 50 states basically be rolling out and implementing different public health plans, as well as then a federal government on the fiscal side, as well as the Federal Reserve. If we're just going to focus the United States just for a little bit here, in making efforts to provide support for the economy. And so on the fiscal side, we've seen 3 sizable stimulus packages, all of them varying in size and scope a little bit, but largely having kind of what I would view as 3 key components to it, and that being a stimulus check going directly to many Americans, a support to the unemployment insurance system, or basically a buttressing of what the existing unemployment insurance system had already been, as well as then protections for firms through the payroll protection plan. So all of these plans basically provide support in those ways, and they've really again mostly provided income support, and we've seen that in the data as I alluded to a little bit ago. And so it's going to be, I think, really important for economists and others to be tracking when it comes to the recovery, is just seeing how both jobs come back, as well as then that income that's been injected into the system once the economy can open back up again, really filter through the economy, and hopefully have some of these sectors that have been truly devastated. You mentioned just a second ago the leisure and hospitality sector. That's a sector that just is nowhere near pre-pandemic levels. There are other sectors that are doing okay, and in fact have even now gotten above pre-pandemic levels. But in just as one example, the leisure and hospitality is one that's really still hurting right now. And so these policies are going to be hopefully supporting of those sectors over the coming months as people can return back to more normal behavior. The other piece of this that I think is important to mention, and just I think provides a little bit of more context in terms of what what the listeners and what the viewers can think about in terms of going forward, is the Federal Reserve also made a very dramatic move. There was not as much room to move as maybe the Fed has had in past recessions, but they made a quick and kind of an immediate drop in the interest rates, and at this point now, and they also opened up other more untraditional lending platforms, but in terms of that main policy lever being the interest rates, it's relatively constrained right now. And again, they've done a lot in terms of the forward guidance of how long the markets can expect that interest rate to be low, but admittedly they're relatively constrained. And so in terms of thinking about going forward, I think one thing that people should keep in mind is that in terms of future policy responses, it's likely going to be coming from the fiscal side of things as opposed to the monetary side of things. So, that would be my couple thoughts on in terms of how past policy as well as maybe future policy might shape things going forward.
Kind of speaking of that as we're hoping to kind of see the light at the end of the tunnel, right? What are some of the indicators that be focusing on as looking at as kind of gauging where we're at and going forward? Like what are some of those key aspects that you'd be looking at?
Yeah, no, it's a great one. So I think what I'll be looking at, one in particular, so the labor market has been sort of one of the themes that have traced through all of my responses here. So I'm going to be keying in on the labor force participation rate. What we've seen in the last year there's been a little bit of a rebound. But what we've seen in the last year is a decline in the labor force participation rate, the size of which basically amounts to what you, if you would have looked over the sort of last 25 or 30 years, as a 10-year move in the labor force participation rate. A decline of about 2 percentage points. And that might not sound, again, like a lot, maybe to many of you, but that decline would be something that, it took us from 2000 to 2010 to do, or 2010 to 2020. And so, and that is a huge barometer of what you can think of as terms of fostering growth, right? How many people are engaged in the economy and earning incomes, and then spending that income in businesses and in other settings. And so I'm going to be really keying in on that. Now, obviously, there's a logical explanation for that drop and why it happened so quickly, in terms of lots of individuals and families had expanded responsibilities at home that required their attention, and I think rightfully so, but how much of that ends up being sticky, I think, is going to end up being something that I really key in on. And on top of that, there's been lots of conversations, appropriately so, about demographic and groups that have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic. And I think on the labor force participation rate here as well, we've seen outcomes for women be particularly troublesome. And so again, I view that as something that I'll be keeping an eye out, as well as then in terms of abroad. I think what I'll be looking at is just the path of the pandemic. So as you mentioned, you can basically track the economy by tracking how that country or that economy has been handling the pandemic as of late. And so in terms of abroad, I'm going to be really keying in on, what are the countries and how are countries abroad doing with the pandemic, how have vaccine rollouts gone, and how can this, continue to support the US economy, which, again, while it's not a primarily export economy, but it certainly is one that has exports playing a key role. And so that'll be one side of it, and then the other side of it will be energy and oil prices. So we saw energy and oil prices, but then prices more broadly. Oil experienced quite a volatile year over these last 12 months, even going negative there for a brief moment. And while the prices mostly stabilized and rebound, there are many countries abroad that's economies, are pretty impacted by the state of energy prices. And so, tracking that and how that also impacts supply chains will be something that I'm keying in on. And then, as you mentioned, we put a lot of money into the system, into the economy. And so I'll also be keeping an eye on just, broad aggregate base level prices. So like the CPI, Consumer Price Index, being kind of the headline number here, and just seeing, have we seen reasons to think that, that there's now more money chasing fewer products, and that's having prices increase. And so that'll be something certainly not something that we've seen in the data thus far, but something that I'll be keeping an eye on, especially given that the Fed has come out and stated a alternative approach or target for that inflation number. So that'll be something that I'm just keeping an eye out going forward over the next several months and year.
And kind of getting some of that the pandemic on the global scale and its impact on the economy and business, and talking about how really a lot of it kind of stems from how our supply lines and trade are just all over the place a little bit, and how those different countries are able to respond from the public health perspective, but also just from their kind of the average citizen perspective, right? Canada is, their individuals are getting X number of thousands of dollars a month, and some of those need to go to basic care, basic income, or basic needs, but how many of that doesn't? And my thought is kind of along the lines of how many people are not necessarily spending that money right now because they're not out of the woods yet, but what happens when all of this money that's been kind of put out in the economy, once everything stabilizes a little bit, is all that going to start getting actually spent?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And so we have again a very good trajectory for the country when it comes to cases specifically. The vaccine rollout has certainly picked up speed, and so I think we're right at and this connects back to, as I said, the forecast for what will be the Q1 number, as well as then the growth for 2021 have all been ticking up modestly. And so but to your point, yes, to the extent that we see really this influx of the cash that's been injected into the system showing up all over the economy, then we might see some small upward pressure on prices. I want to emphasize, we haven't seen it yet. I don't want to be the alarmist or have any alarm bells go off that I'm the one claiming of hyperinflation. But again, something to be tracking and keeping an eye on.
Yeah, and one thing I'm curious to kind of watch and see. Really before the pandemic hit, there was a lot more conversation, especially in the previous administration, on trade policy, some of those conversations with China and all of that. And certainly it seems that with the pandemic, everybody just kind of put all those conversations on hold, rightfully so, because everybody's in a recession and has to take care of their own stuff. What do you think that all might look like as the pandemic kind of opens up and you start looking at those conversations a little bit tighter again?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and if the pandemic has taught us anything, it's to be weary of jumping into making predictions along those lines. But I'll go ahead and do it. So where do I think things could be headed on that front? So there's been actually, I think now, one of the few things that has more or less bipartisan support has been taking a stronger stance, at least on trade policy towards China. So now that doesn't hold in terms of the trade policies for many other trading partners of the United States, but in terms of China, that has been one that has some amount of bipartisan support. So and certainly since the last meeting with the Biden, the first meeting with the Biden administration with China, it certainly seems like there's not going to be an immediate drawback or pullback of those tariffs that got put into place pre-pandemic. So reading the tea leaves here, so to speak, I see still probably a pretty aggressive stance when it comes to the protectionist policies that have been put into place on China. But at the same time, I think that there's likely to be probably a little bit more opening up when it comes to the trade policies, and perhaps a bit more participation in large, broad-based trade agreements with, say, our other trading partners. That would just be, again, my read of kind of the lay of the land when it comes to the language that's been spoken about these issues. But I think certainly time will tell. There's going to have to be, as the recovery completes, some decisions that the administration makes about exactly again all these existing trade policies that have been put in place basically since 2016, and what they'll want to do with them.
Yeah, and normally I think those conversations would be a lot more kind of at the forefront of everybody's thoughts with the change of the new administration, especially seeing the larger shift in just general attitude and perspective on the U.S.'s role in the world and the world economy. Right, these two administrations are tackling that from very different perspectives, and again, it's kind of just has a little bit of a pause button right now. Just it's hard to have those conversations when every other country is dealing in the middle of a pandemic. So as they pop out of that to varying degrees of success, it'll be interesting to see which direction all that goes. And even in the middle of all this, again, we've mentioned it. You've mentioned it before, of just the impact of supply chains, and we've had other guests on this series that have recently talked about just, you might want to, as a business in the U.S., right? You might want to look at more diversifying your supply chain. Just, is this going to be the last pandemic we're going to experience? Who knows? But yeah, like, putting all your eggs and everything that you make you sell is produced in China. Well, what happens if this happens again and supply lines get cut? So
yeah, no, and so actually that's a great point. And actually, I think connects with kind of another, I think, point that I think is just would be helpful and informative, I think, in terms of just thinking about where we can expect things going forward. And that is, businesses, you mentioned in particular, but we've all had to basically really over the last year adjust a lot of things. So businesses on the supply chain, how they serve their customers has been another piece to this that's had to be really pretty radically adjusted. And then individuals as well that have had to really reshape how they go to work, how they maybe teach their children, all these sorts of things. And I think one thing that's interesting about that is, it's probably unlikely that we've gone through all of these changes and we've actually been doing all these changes for another year, for a whole year, and that none of them end up being revealed as sort of things that we actually might like and actually might think, hey, this was actually maybe a little bit better of a way of doing things. And I think this hits to your point about the supply chain. Than what we had been doing before. And actually, so, and I love, there's this really cool research that sort of just really typifies this point. And that is, there was some really nice work that came out about, people commuting in London and riding the London tube. And what they showed was, look, like there was this strike that happened that knocked out a couple tube stops, for 2 days. This was a 2-day pandemic, right? Not a 12-month pandemic, but a 2-day, stoppage of at least for some people that were commuting in London, their sort of natural first way to get to work. And what they found actually was after that 2 days, so you had a bunch of people that had to experiment, right? They had to go and basically get another tube stop or take a different route, take a different line. And not everyone went back, right? They all had, a bunch of people had to get experimented and took a different route to get to work those couple of days. And actually what a bunch of people found out is that they hadn't been before on their fastest route. And so I think, that's just a really, I think, it's an example that, again, might not speak to many of you when it comes to like what we've had to been dealing with in the pandemic, but I think it signifies the fact that having a naive approach that just like all the things that have happened over the last 12 months are just going to be immediately reverted and will show back up that, July 2021 is going to look a lot like February 2020 is just, I think, perhaps not the most appropriate way to think about what we can think about and seeing in terms of the economy going forward.
Sure. And, I think one of the most big aspects that comes to mind to having that conversation is, the work from home policies. And I know Indiana University is having some of those conversations, and I know there's a lot of companies that are looking at, no, we can't have all of our employees work from home. And well, they have, and engaging productivity and from, a parent working from home, and some things are extremely nice. And, what is this all going to look like when everybody can go back? I think a lot of companies are having those thoughts and working through those conversations and trying to put some policies in place. Because it's kind of shown that some people can still be as productive and maybe have a little bit more flexibility, and some might not be able to, certainly. And it'll be interesting to see the overall repercussions of some of that, right? And we've seen that people are moving and working remotely, and it'll be curious if that continues through as we go forward.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. There will be lots of discussions both within businesses, within families, within schools, and all sorts of institutions throughout that will be, again, hopefully learning for the better, right? Learning, what works, what didn't work, what what now once the hopefully the pandemic is behind us, what can we sort of move forward with in terms of making and creating better outcomes for everybody. So yeah, no, it'll be certainly an exciting time, and an exciting time to be tracking kind of how all these things unfold. But I think certainly to your point, it's unlikely that we're going to be just reverting back to exactly status quo before anyone knew what COVID-19 was.
Well, I can certainly probably only imagine as an economist and somebody that's looking closer. I can only imagine as somebody that, as an economist and enjoys looking at all that information, all that data, and kind of just making the speculations. It seems like in this whole process, you've had a lot of information and tools to kind of just look at and explore. And as you go forward, that's going to continue for a little while afterwards as you kind of dissect the recession. And again, having one caused by a public health crisis that we haven't seen in so long.
Yeah, no, I think you take the pandemic out of it. As you mentioned, the response on the data side, and actually the creativity and ingenuity that both firms, researchers in academic and public policy and throughout, I think has been really maybe kind of a nice silver lining to all this, and just that we've seen really just a great effort to make data available, to make data transparent, and to make the best that we can do with it. And so, yeah, I certainly hope, as an empirical economist, that that's sort of my go-to input, right, in terms of my production function. So I certainly hope that doesn't just immediately evaporate or go away. But I certainly would expect that we're likely to see more of that continue.
Sure. Well, Andrew, thanks again for spending some time today talking to us about trying to condense down this massive subject into a 20-minute 5-question interview. But I think you gave us definitely some key points and some valuable information that can kind of help some folks wrap their heads around it a little bit, and just some things to keep in mind for future efforts. So thanks again.
No, thank you. I really appreciate having the conversation. I hope it was helpful.
That's it for this edition of Cyber Focus. For future topics or suggestions, please drop us a line at cyber@indiana.edu.